change in the fundraising sector has never been greater. But innovations in technology are evolving faster than our ability to understand them. Are these advances good or bad? Do they have unintended consequences? And what is the application to the global fundraising sector? That's what we're here to find out. Welcome to the Fundraising AI Podcast, your up-to-date resource for responsible AI for the global fundraising community, hosted by Nathan Chappell and Scott Rosenkrantz.
All right, welcome everyone. We're so excited to be here on another Fundraising AI podcast, episode 13. I was just informed. So I know Scott and I are having a ton of fun doing these, and hopefully they're helpful for you as you're maybe overwhelmed with all that's going on in AI and distilling some of that down. But one of the things that we really love is just for the first time having guests on and hearing kind of their AI journey and that kind of thing. And so today is one of those days. We have Joanna Drew on the call with Scott Rosenkrantz and I. And Joanna, it is great for you to be here calling in from Chicago, right?
Yep, that's where I'm at.
Awesome. Well, Joanna, were actually just introduced to each other last year, I think, somehow before Fundraising AI. I think I probably just saw you online and reached out to you, or you reached out to me. And we, I know, started talking before the Fundraising AI Summit last year. Scott just said that he's been privately stalking you on LinkedIn for a while now. So I speak for him.
I'm flattered.
And you should be, because he has a pretty high bar for stalking AI people. So,
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't just stalk anyone. Right.
Cool.
You're in a list of like 300 people. So that's a pretty select
I'll take
list.
it.
It's great to have you here, Joanna. I think as someone that I've seen kind of rise up and through the social channels in applied AI since, I guess, the last couple of years, I just thought it'd be great to have you on and really talk about your journey and where you got started. So before we get going, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit and share what you do and maybe a little bit about the past, and then we'll get into the meat of it.
Yeah, sure. So first, I just want to thank you so much for having me. I'm just really honored to be a part of this. As Nathan mentioned, I founded an international grant writing consulting firm called Hilo Consulting in 2020. So we primarily serve small grassroots organizations with budgets well below $1 million, helping them to pursue grants successfully. And so before founding Hilo Consulting, I have worked in a number of fundraising jobs, starting off as a development assistant to planning fundraising events at the Anti-Defamation League to wearing various hats in fundraising and marketing for a small grassroots NGO in Guatemala. And after having lived abroad for 5 years, I came back to the US, to Chicago, my hometown, in the early stages of the pandemic, and was really forced to rebuild and restart my life here. And so, as I'm not really keen on the 9-to-5 structure, I never in my wildest imagination did I think that I would start my own business. But my old boss actually reached out to me from Guatemala asking if I would work on a grant proposal for him. And that sparked the idea. And from there, I said, oh, wow, I could do this for other organizations. And I created a website and an email address without a client to speak of, and started to tap my network of other nonprofits and built my company from there. And so very proudly have raised over $1 million in grant funding for my clients. And I'm just really grateful to be able to support such wonderful organizations, and especially at that startup stage.
That's awesome.
You're working with a lot of clients. Are you seeing them using AI on their own? Is AI a conversation that they're coming to you about? Are you collaborating with them? How does that come?
Or are you their AI?
Yeah. So it depends on the organization, right? And so these are very small organizations. And when I mean small, it's $500,000 budgets and below. So they are strapped, right? They are putting on programs, they're fundraising, they're doing all of the things all the time. And so it's really not on their radar. I have had one client of mine ask me about it, sort of cursory, but we never got a chance to connect. I said, I'd love to share some ideas with you, start thinking about ways we can plug this in. But that's sort of where the conversation left off, because they're just pulled in a million directions.
That's awesome. I'm so curious. Well, I'm about a lot of things, but my wife having gone to Guatemala last year, to do some nonprofit missions work, and the needs are so different, right? I mean, it's great that you have a heart there, and it sounds like internationally. How different is it? Like, so you gotta put your US domestic fundraising hat on, and you kind of see, and we think in the US, like fundraising revolves around us when we know it doesn't. What what do you think the difference is? Like, are there stark contrasts between how fundraising gets done in a maybe not just Guatemala, but a place like Guatemala?
Yeah. So the clients that I work for are 501c3 organizations. So their fundraising is primarily done in the US,
Okay.
global north, and the funding trickles down from there. There's not really a philanthropic landscape to speak of in Guatemala. However, Luis Von Ahn, who founded reCAPTCHA and now is on Duolingo, he started a foundation there and is really taking trust-based philanthropy to heart and investing multi-year large grants up to 20% of an organization's operating budget with very little reporting requirements. And so that's really an anomaly, but it's really heartening that that's happening. And certainly there are a group of funders that are very concentrated on Central America, but then you're also competing against all these other nonprofits for the same pool of funding. So it's definitely challenging to fundraise internationally, especially again as a small organization.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
since coming back to the States after spending time out there, has it changed? I mean, you were in development before, then you went to Guatemala. Coming back, have it changed your perspective, changed your approach, changed your philosophy?
Yes. I mean, I think the inequality in resources is so apparent, whereas it's always this power dynamic, right? You're always having the global north or the ones with the power that are dictating where the money is going. And so it's really maddening. It's really frustrating. It's something that doesn't seem to be changing. And I think that it's just the process, and it's sort of a broken system. And so that those power dynamics are even more exacerbated when you're talking about wealthy countries and then developing countries.
Well, I think that's such an interesting segue into, I know we sent you some possible questions and we've diverged within the first 30 seconds. So appreciate the flexibility here. One of the things that Scott and I have been talking about recently is that IMF did a study or report that they released, I don't know, Scott, probably 2 months ago now. It's been out for a little while, showing that essentially AI, it was about AI and job augmentation, not necessarily displacement, but 60% of jobs are going to be impacted in developed nations by AI. Still 20, 30, 40% in less developed nations. But the sub context that didn't get a lot of airtime was that while that happens, it's going to increase inequality. And so we see kind of this global trend of increase in inequality and inequity. Then we kind of look at the nonprofit sector and we're like, well, that's why the nonprofit sector exists. So how do we address that increase in inequity if we're not armed in the nonprofit sector with the same tools that are creating the inequity? So I think it's fascinating that you started a business at a really interesting time when all of that is happening. I'm curious in your path, like starting this business, did you go to AI to like help you craft narrative or content for your website, for ideas on how to market yourself, any of that?
No, I was only introduced to AI sort of with the general population about last year. And so everything I created, although I have to admit my brother is a copywriter, so he helped me create content for my website. But other than that, I have been playing around with it now, just in terms of trying to brainstorm and develop ideas. I've asked it about business plans and sort of big ideas and how to move things forward. But at the time when I started my website, I didn't even know much about AI at all.
So if you did it over again today, would that be different based on your kind of new orientation around AI?
Great question. Honestly, I don't think so. Just because a lot of what I crafted, especially my first website, which is now defunct because it, it needed an upgrade, but it just all came from in my heart. And it was just something, because the name of my company is Hilo Consulting, and Hilo is actually Spanish for thread. And so that is a metaphor that my company is a thread that connects organizations to funding opportunities. And so it really just sort of evolved from my passion, my vision, and what I want to achieve, being able to empower organizations, power dynamics and all, but being able to provide them with an avenue to be able to secure resources through this unique position that I bring as someone who lived in this country context, but also am from this country. So I thought that that was a nice bridge between my passion and really the objective of my work.
In your use of AI now, what are your go-tos? What are the other things that you're trying out or things that you've kind of rely on regularly for that as a project?
Yeah, sure. So as a grant writer, I'm primarily in the LLM space. So we've got the common names, ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, Gemini. And so I will often use these to enhance my grant writing. And one of my favorite use cases is actually being able to draw parallels between an organization's work and a funder's funding priorities. Because I always ask, like, how does your work help us achieve our mission, kind of thing. And sometimes those are stretches, right? And so I will use those tools to find those connections. And something I started playing around with lately is asking these 4 systems that I named the same questions to see how their answers vary. And especially when I'm looking for sources, right? We have to provide sources in Gemini as well. And so just starting to get familiar with the differences in the tools and of course to prevent those hallucinations or misinformation in my use. And then I use Otter to transcribe my meetings. I started playing around with Fathom. I haven't adopted it quite yet just because I bought into Otter. So
It's the same. Yeah, they're all kind of the same, but that's awesome.
yeah. And then I begrudgingly use Alexa at home to
Don't we all?
add to my grocery list, but that's really at my wife's insistence. So
Yeah, I think it was our last podcast, Scott and I were talking about how stupid Alexa is. We're like, why is Alexa so dumb? We're like so tired of it. And Siri, Alexa, it's amazing because they were so advanced prior. And now they just are like, it's like talking to like a little child that doesn't understand multiple tasks. So I want to follow that thread, pun intended, in that when you were building your own work, your own company, and you felt like authenticity was like the most important thing. And I really respect that. And even your hesitation on like maybe using it again, if you rebuilt your business, Scott and I probably use one of the tools before we have our cereal in the morning, probably for like to figure out what kind of cereal we're going to have. So we're like on the opposite end of the spectrum, but I love that because it's not a one size fits all. Everyone has to do what feels authentic, and sounding authentic is not the same as being authentic. When you're thinking about it from the grant perspective though, how does that translate to you? Like, and have you seen a shift in this? Is there tension that's been created by, of course, it's much easier to write a grant proposal or at least proof one to send it to a funder. Are they getting more grant proposals now than ever? And are they doing what universities are doing, which is either like, can't use this at all, or we're going to give you an F, or are they saying use it because that's the most effective use of your time? Like, what does the funding environment look like with AI these days?
yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because we all know that it's here, and funders, of course, know that nonprofits are going to use this tool, but I don't think that they're at the technological point to be able to even know what that means, right? Like, I'm not sure that they would know how to screen an application unless they're an early adopter and have a tool that's going to screen AI drafted proposals. But there's really little movement in the philanthropy space, at least in my experience. I know on the grant side, you have the company Grantable, where you can supplement your grant writing through that. You could just use an LLM. So it's definitely being used on the grant writer side of things. One of my colleagues was approached by a potential client, a nonprofit, that asked, do you use AI to write proposals? And I'm a coach in that community. And I said, I think it's important to be honest, right? Because we're all using this tool in some way or another, and you can't blacklist it, because I think it's important to bring it to the forefront and saying like, this is a tool. It's merely a tool. It doesn't
Right.
take away my expertise, my strategic thinking as to how to approach grants. It just enhances my work and creates efficiencies. So really having that conversation, I think, is really important.
And if I could just touch on that before you jump in, Scott, I think that's so important. I spent 20 years in the nonprofit space, and it's kind of like the dichotomy between like funders want you to be more efficient, right? Because they want to invest their dollars in organizations that are going to put their dollars to best use. But at the same time, it's ironic that they might punish you for using AI. And it could be, and I've been thinking more about this. I had a conversation with the chief development officer 2 weeks ago. They moved away from talking about it as artificial intelligence. They're only using augmented intelligence. Because you as a grant writer or a nonprofit, is there very little difference of saying, okay, well, I'm going to sit in a room and collaborate with 3 people to augment my intelligence to write the best grant proposal versus having a technological tool that essentially is free, is truly the best use of your time to actually augment and enhance what you're doing. So it's interesting what you're saying, and I'm not surprised that like the sector's not quite sure how to really think about this yet. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in again because I think like if we look at the grant proposal as this mechanism that is to build a relationship, right, which is transactional, right? Primarily transactional. It's inauthentic. And so maybe there's a better way by using AI to facilitate human to human connection, site visits, freeing up nonprofit time to not have to create this proposal, whereas AI can aggregate data and provide a funder with the information that they're getting from the grant proposal, right? So I think there's so much potential to upend the philanthropic sector as it exists today through the use of AI and get us back to that really authentic relationship building and going to an organization to see the work that they're doing or talking to the leadership, because you can get such a stronger sense of their work, their values, their impact with those conversations.
I was at a conference a couple months ago talking about AI. We opened it up to questions at the end. And one of the first questions was from a grant writer. And she's like, I don't think that this is going to help me. How would I use it in my day to day? Right. So you mostly work with smaller organizations that don't have that resource. For those large organizations where they do have a grant writer, what are some pointers? What are some do's or don'ts if they haven't started and just are curious about it or know that they should give it a shot?
Yeah. So something that I actually learned at the fundraising AI conference was that you can use AI to, well, first, of course, brainstorming, like I mentioned, drawing parallels between funders' funding priorities and the work the organization does. But you can also put in your text of a grant that you've written already and ask the LLM to grade it on a scale of 1 to 100. And then once they give you the grade, then you can ask for feedback on how to improve it. And this was Gail Roberts in one of her sessions. And this is just, if you're resistant to actually having it write for you, you write the whole thing yourself and then get feedback from it and see maybe it's going to identify a missing connection or something that you can use to strengthen your argument or the problem statement or the need. So I think just playing around with it, really, I think that's the phase that we're at, is just encouraging experimentation and to start small. It doesn't have to rate your whole grant proposal for you, but let's break it down section by section, right? So how would you answer this question and see what the LLM comes up with and weave it into your work? But I think that it's this social sector resistance to this technology where it's scary, right? Because you don't understand it. And it's really important to just lean into that curiosity over fear and start, right? Because it's here and it's not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's so interesting, because do you ever think about then you're essentially training people to replace you in some ways, right? Like start small, break it down by these kind of in buckets. Is and this is kind of an antagonistic question, but like, do you ever think that AI will replace you in that sense? Or do you ever think about that? Or
So yes, I do think about that. And essentially that was sort of why I decided I'm not going to be fearful of this. I'm going to lean into it and I'm going to see where it takes me. And so I think it's really important to consider that things are going to change. They're going to change. And so I think now the more common understanding is AI isn't going to replace you, but people who don't know how to use AI will be replaced. So there's always going to need to be a person involved in the grants process. So the writing, sure, you can have that be a little bit more efficient, creative, automated, but then there's the funder meetings, right? The strategic outreach, the prospect research, all of these other human in the loop pieces of the grants management process and managing the grants calendar. So there's certainly elements to the whole philanthropic process that requires a human. But I think about what you mentioned earlier, Nathan, is this inundation of proposal submissions. What's going to happen? Our foundation's going to become invite only. And then you're, again, precluding more organizations from having funding opportunities. Is the whole sector will change and can change. And I'm okay with that. I'm leaning into it. And I think that if it moves into a space where funding is distributed more equitably, reaches these smaller organizations, is deployed faster, then that's for the betterment of the sector as a whole. So
an awesome way to think about that. And I would say, while all those things that you mentioned are about how you use technology to become more human, right? And I think those opportunities to use technology to offload some of the mundane things so that you could spend more time providing your experience and adding value to clients in different ways. And that's what, of course, Scott and I really remain AI optimists. There's a lot of fear around, people go immediately, it's going to replace me and it's just going to automate everything. And I think in a trust-based business and a human-based business, that's not good for anyone. But I love what you're sharing about how you kind of take some of that, use technology where it helps create efficiency, but then take that dividend of time and then be able to add value to clients in a more human-to-human way. I think that's just very smart and comforting to a lot of people who might be on the side of like, I don't want anything to do with it because it's just scary to me.
So we could probably guess how you're going to answer this, but how would you label yourself as either techno-optimist or techno-pessimist? And maybe not even necessarily in the philanthropy world, but like AI. Is it Terminator? Is it Wall-E? Where do you think this is all going to end up?
So I have to stay on the optimistic side. I think I just want to remain hopeful. I think that truly right now we are at this inflection point where we, individuals, civil society, we can take part and shape the way that AI is developed and going to be used in the future. And so I think that the democratized access of these tools currently lends itself to that. I think the social sector plays a role in that responsible AI adoption. And healthcare and innovation with medicine is an incredible potential. So I definitely want to stay on that side of the fence, but I do acknowledge, right, the drawbacks and the dystopian kind of future it can create. I think hedging against algorithmic bias, as we know, we have to, of course, mention that. I think big tech monopolizing the industry and in the name of profit and competition, and negating the cascading negative effects that can cause in society as a whole. And as we touched upon before earlier about the digital divide, right? And this becoming a digital chasm. So I think that we have to keep it in balance, right? There's definitely going to be the drawbacks, but I think getting more people on board and leaning again into that curiosity over fear and participating in the way that they can and how these systems are developed and used, I think we can stay on the optimistic, sort of hopeful side. I think technology has contributed to the evolution of our species. That's undeniable. And so I think really considering that we are at that turning point. And so the more that individuals weigh in, the more that we participate in it, I think the better off it's going to serve everyone as a whole.
That's awesome, Joanna. And probably there probably could not be a better place for us to end. I mean, you just essentially replaced both Scott and I in any of our thinking on how this kind of goes down. But I just want to say thank you so much for joining us on the Fundraising AI podcast. I mean, you add so much value to our sector, and obviously from the national, international perspective. And we continue to look forward to ways to collaborate and see you and your work really blossom. So thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, any last words for Scott or you?
I wanted to say thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun and such a pleasure to chat with you and kind of nerd out about this stuff. And I like to go in the existential space too, because I think that's a really fun place to be as well.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining, Joanna. Really appreciate having you on. For anybody listening, please continue to listen. Please continue to share, but also reach out to us on LinkedIn and let us know what you want to hear, what you want us to talk about, what you want us to stop talking about, whatever it is.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you on the next episode. Take care.